Joining me now in the studio, talkTV's chief political commentator Peter Cardwell, good to see you, and human rights campaigner Peter Tatchell. Good to have you both here. So let's set the political scene with you, Peter. Obviously, these protests have taken place regularly ever since October the 7th, some all over the country, every other weekend in London. And James Cleverly, it sounds as if he's had enough.
They're very large protests. They're very controversial in some ways. There are definitely some Islamists who are part of that. There have been anti-Semitic slogans that have been shown and have been part of that. The vast majority of people, of course, are not Islamists. The vast majority of people are peaceful on those protests. But nonetheless, whatever you think of them, whether you think they should go ahead or not, they are putting a huge pressure on the Metropolitan Police. The most pressure they've been under, the government says, since the 2012 Olympics. And James Cleverly, as Home Secretary, making the point, although of course it is in line with his political view on this as well, that the protests have made their point and it's time to stop. It's interesting as well that it's not just about the cost of policing, it's also about the nature of London. There are lots of businesses that are suffering because of this, because of the different ideas around closing roads and so on. So it's a very live political issue in this regard. There's also the fact that there were protests outside Parliament recently when there was the Gaza vote going on, and some MPs said they felt intimidated by some of those protesters. So this is a very live political issue. It's something that's very important to the government. I don't think it's going to make a blind button of difference. It is interesting, though, in freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, which are, of course, British values we all hold very dearly, and many other countries hold them dearly as well. But the point is that in some parts of the United Kingdom, where I'm from, in Northern Ireland, there is a parades commission, and it makes decisions whether it's within the public interest for parades to go ahead, especially highly contentious political parades. So I wonder if James Cleverly is perhaps looking there to see for some inspiration in terms of how to bring things forward.
And two other issues to discuss before we go to Peter Tatchell on this. The first is the cost. Now, you may say free speech is precious, it's infinitely valuable to all, it doesn't matter how much it costs to protect it, it's so precious that the price is irrelevant. Or you might say, oh my God, it's so expensive. I mean, the estimate of how much it's cost so far to police these repetitive protests is what? Is it £25 million?
It's certainly in the tens of millions, depending depends on which period, but certainly around £28 million.
And also the strain that it puts on the police force in terms of officers having to show up, and in terms of the sheer number that have to be present every time, that kind of thing. So cost is one issue, yes, of course, and some people will think that's extremely important, and others will think it's not important at all, where principle is concerned. The other issue, of course, is that for the Jewish community of London in particular, it has been said by many, and said by some people on this programme, that it has made London seem to them and feel to them a kind of impenetrable citadel, that they can't go for a walk in central London. They feel nervous in the various outskirts of London where the coaches of protesters often arrive from the north of England. They feel overwhelmed, definitely massively outnumbered, because on one of the marches 300,000 people marched, and there's a total of less than 250,000 Jewish people in the whole of this country. So the number of marchers outnumber the number of Jews in the country easily. But feeling that as Jews in London, they are kind of almost crowded out of and intimidated to enter and go about their normal life in their own city, and that this has happened every other weekend since October the 7th. So those are two more issues, aren't they, to be taken into consideration?
They certainly are, and whilst there is evidence that there have been some Jewish people on these marches, the fact is that there are people who are very anti-Jewish. There are anti-Semitic slogans. There are chants that people have been saying. We've had a lot of political controversy over the past few days about people talking about no-go areas in London, but a no-go area is only a no-go area if you think it is. And there are certainly Jewish people who feel that where these protesters are protesting, they feel they can't go there. There are also businesses that have suffered from it as well. So it's a very big issue for a lot of people.
All right, let me bring Peter Tatchell into this. Peter, as far as you're concerned, this is about a principle, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yes.
The right to protest is a fundamental hallmark of a democratic society. It's what distinguishes democracies from dictatorships. And I'm sad to say that the current government has been progressively restricting the right to protest in ways that we've only often seen in other autocracies around the world.
Can you
say
what they are? What sort of ways have they restricted protest?
Well, the kinds of penalties that people are now suffering. I mean, 2 Just Stop Oil protesters engaged in an entirely peaceful protest. One has been jailed for 3 years and another for 2 years and 7 months.
Which protest was it? What did it do? Who did it stop? What did it do?
It didn't stop anything.
What was it?
It was on the Dartford Crossing, unfurling a banner. It didn't disrupt or stop the traffic, but the police decided that they were going to go for those guys, and they're now in prison. This is the longest sentence for any peaceful protest in modern British history. It's what the kind of thing that Putin does in Russia. It's absolutely outrageous, and this government is sanctioning it, and progressively their restrictions are making it more and more difficult and more threatening to go on a protest because you don't know how the police are going to operate.
I mean, it's interesting to hear you say that in the light of the fact that these pro-Palestinian, pro-ceasefire marches have taken place and a profusion of people attending them every fortnight since October. It's now the end of February. So when you talk about the difficulty of protesting and how, people's wings are being clipped and the kind of heavy-handed policing that you might receive, I don't think that's the general impression.
Well,
and that's why James Cleverly has said what he said, isn't it?
The protests have not been heavily policed so far, but what James Cleverly and his underling propose is to impose new restrictions which are unjustified. Those protests, the total of attendees on those protests over the last few months has been well in excess of 3 million people. There have been a small number of a few hundred incidents where people have been arrested. They haven't yet been convicted and may not be convicted, but there have been some bad things that happen, I agree. But you cannot demonise and misrepresent an entirely, overwhelmingly peaceful protest on the basis of what a handful of bad apples have done. And I've got to say, on every single one of those marches, there have been huge blocks of Jewish people who've been marching to call for a ceasefire. They have not been abused, they've been welcomed, and I've got Jewish friends myself who've been on those marches. They say they've never received a slightest bit of anti-Semitism, never seen
There's
any
definitely anti-Semitism on those marches. There's definitely. We've seen the slogans, we've seen people arrested for it, we've seen the banners and so on. They may not have personally experienced that, but it's definitely happening every single week.
You can't base that on what a few hundred people out of 3 million have done to damn a whole. This is the outrageous.
But may I say something? That's not what James Cleverly has said or done. Maybe because he's clever. He hasn't said that at all. He hasn't said, I don't want this to happen because of these bad apples. I haven't wanted to do it because of these violently racist anti-Semites. I haven't done this. I want to stop this because of those people who are calling for the eradication and genocide of all Israelis so that they can be pushed into the sea and then Charlotte Church can lead another chorus of From the River to the Sea. He hasn't said that at all. He said something very different. And this is why I think it's so particularly interesting. What James Cleverly has said is, I don't know whether we need to have any more of these marches because they've made their point. We've heard it. We all know what they want and we all know what they don't want. They've said it. We get it. Now let's stop it, because what he says is, what's the point? They could do it every fortnight for months. It's not going to affect any decisions in the Middle East at all. It's very expensive, dangerous for some people. It's a waste of our resources. We've got the gist of it. We've got the hint. We know what they're saying. Enough already. Now, I wonder what you make of that.
In a democracy, we don't have the view that you can protest once and you mustn't protest again. Clearly, the protests have not been adequate because we still have a government that is basically supporting Israel's war crimes in Gaza. We haven't changed that. 10,000 children have been killed by the Israeli. 10,000 children. They've got nothing to do with Hamas. Those are war crimes like the October the 7th attack. I've got to tell you this. Israel has killed more children than Hamas, and that's a shocking indictment and a reason why these protests must continue until we get a change of British and Western policy. You cannot put a price on democracy.
But do you believe that our government has the power to influence what goes on in the Middle East? Do you think that our government can bring pressure to bear, and if it had brought different pressure, there would already be a ceasefire? Or do you believe that with all the protesting that we could possibly muster, even if they were protesting every day and 3 million people were congregating in London every day saying the same thing and chanting the same chants, it would be exactly the same in the Middle East anyway?
Well, we've seen more MPs vote for a ceasefire than before, so that's progress. Certainly Britain has financial leverage, which it could be using, of course, not alone, but together with the United States and other allies. We collectively can pressure the Israelis to say it's got to stop. I mean, look what's happening on the West Bank. On the West Bank, Palestinian people have been living there for generations, are having their homes seized by extremist settlers who are seizing and destroying their homes, destroying their farmlands, destroying their crops, and nobody's doing anything about it.
All right, let me bring Peter back. Let me just bring Peter back in for a final word on this. So James Cleverly has spoken. We all know what he said. We get the point. Stop doing it now. It's enough. But is that just rhetoric? He's not going to take any steps, is he, to restrict people's right to protest, or is he going to act on what he said?
Well, what he might do is to increase the length of time that notice has to be given for these protests. So we'll see if that happens. But certainly, I mean, Peter is a long-serving protester on many issues, who I admire greatly, even though I respectfully disagree with him on many things. But I'm not sure Benjamin Netanyahu is sitting in Jerusalem thinking what the people are protesting on the streets of London about is affecting his actions in any way.
All right, thank you both very much indeed for coming in.